Humankind has thrived as a species of omnivore with a large variety of eating patterns, many of which have developed in traditional fashion into superb, life-sustaining cuisines. The so-called Mediterranean diet is one of these, as are patterns in parts of Asia. Indeed, the corn and bean combinations of Central America are another outstanding traditional eating pattern. Although salting fish to preserve it has been a problem over the eons, both traditional and urban populations that have regular, substantial intake of fish and seafood tend to have a better overall picture of health, and cardiovascular health in particular. Everything we know about fish and marine animals and their fatty acids, at least until the issue of mercury came along, has been favorable. In mid-century, several streams of knowledge came together, leading to the 7-country study and to our early ideas about preventing heart attacks. First, heart attacks largely disappeared in Scandinavia during the privations of World War II, but they came back with a vengeance after the war. A new epidemic was recognized. Then there were folks we called medical Marco Polos, distinguished physicians and scientists who returned from travels, telling us about some cultures where heart attacks were rare and others where they were an overwhelming cause of death. They also brought back with them hypotheses about lifestyle and diet as causes for these differences. As a result, some clinicians and laboratory scientists began to turn their curiosity outside the clinic and the laboratory to cultures from which their heart patients derived. Thus, cardiovascular disease epidemiology and preventive cardiology were born. The 7-country study sought a more formal explanation of the role of diet and lifestyle in these marked cultural contrasts in heart attack rates. What is good health? We usually identify good health among populations by their low mortality rates and their overall longevity. If we base an idea of health on the absence of premature heart attack and other common diseases, and keep freedom from disability in the back of our mind, plus long life, then we find the best examples among populations in the Mediterranean basin and parts of the Orient. What the Mediterranean peoples ate when we studied them in the 1950s and 60s is now widely known as the Mediterranean diet. There are other time-tested, healthful, traditional diets to be found in Asia, and particularly in Latin America. These eating patterns are characterized by a substantial proportion of energy from plant foods, by a low intake of saturated fats from dairy and fatty meats, and by whole grains and a predominance of fresh fruits and vegetables and legumes, peas and beans. Meats are much leaner than beef in this country and are used as condiments rather than as the central part of the meal. There's chicken once or twice a week and fish 2 or 3 times a week. Those are the characteristics of diets in the more healthy regions we have studied. In the 7-country study, we studied people involved in traditional activities. The total energy output or expenditure of different peoples varies remarkably. As far as we can estimate, hunter-gatherers usually worked in subsistence activities only 18 to 24 hours a week. The populations of the Greek islands, for example, work much more than that, but they work at an interesting pace. They almost never sweat or get out of breath, and their work in the field or in harvesting or winnowing the grain rarely gets their heart rate above half capacity. Their physical activity is characterized by as little excess activity as possible, by steady, regular, large muscle activity, and by daily patterns of alternating work and rest. People on Crete and Corfu in the late 50s and 60s still had a simple, traditional lifestyle. They were very active physically. They walked from town to their work in nearby fields or groves, and it was much later that they began to have mopeds, motorcycles, and eventually trucks. They walked home in midday for a main meal and a fine siesta under their grape arbor with their family and colleagues. Then they went back and worked until dusk, and this was followed by a long Mediterranean evening. These traditional patterns seemed to lead to good health. The same was true in Japan, with the exception that there was much more fish eating, but a countervailing, unhappy influence of extremely high salt intake, hypertension, and hemorrhagic strokes. But in Japan, they had and have still today a phenomenally low rate of heart attacks. In stark contrast is the pattern based on saturated fats that have allowed people to work and survive in harsh northern climates, but led to artery diseases at relatively young ages. Where eating patterns have focused on one grain or one vegetable staple, such as potatoes or polished rice, a narrow cuisine based on a single crop, humans have gotten into trouble with malnutrition or with famine. Where there's greater variety, where fruits and vegetables are at the forefront, where the starches are associated with whole grains, peas and beans, where the meat is lean or wild, many dietary combinations are quite successful.